Hello, welcome to Hard Talk Extra. I'm Gavin Esler. My guest today is one half, the talkative half of the Pet Shop Boys, the iconic band who since the 1980s have influenced everyone from Madonna to Robbie Williams and the Scissor Sisters. They're beginning another tour and their stage performances have always been something special. So where do they fit into 21st century music? What keeps them going? And at a time when pop music often means lowbrow pap, are they in danger of giving pop a good name? Neil Tennant, welcome to the programme.
Hello, nice to be here.
When you first started out, you said you didn't want to tour at all. Now you're off to, I think, Brazil, Lithuania and Australia, among other places. What's going on? Do you need the money?
When we first started, it wasn't so much we didn't want to tour. We had very strong ideas about what we wanted to do. You know, I worked for 3 years for Smash Hits magazine, and in that period I saw tons of concerts, and I thought the format of the rock concert was a bit boring. And Chris and I had this idea that when we toured, we'd do an amazing sort of theatrical extravaganza. And we couldn't afford to do that till the late 80s. We hadn't sold enough records. And then, so the first tour we did with the film director, Derek Jarman, and he made films, and his people designed these amazing costumes, and we had all these dancers and stuff. And so we did what we wanted to do, and since then, I think we're the only group who regularly has a theatre designer or director that directs the proceedings. We see it very much as a show, and a show is what we always want to put on.
Because performance is that important to you?
Yeah, I think it started off because there's just two of us in the Pet Shop Boys, and we thought if Chris played the keyboards and I stood there and sang, it might be a bit boring.
Let's look at a clip and just give people a flavour of it. Here's a recent concert.
When I look back upon my life, it's always with a sense of shame. I've always been the one to blame. For everything I long to do, no matter when or where or who.
Well, that was last year. Does the new tour build on that? Is that part of the act?
Yes, it's designed by this theatre designer called Ez Devlin, who's done a lot of work for National Theatre and opera and what have you. And it's a multimedia show, just like the Derek Jarman show was, with film and elements of costumes and theatre in it.
Is that how you? One of the ways you keep interested, because you know it's for some people pop music is a sprint, one hit, that's it. For you, it's been the opposite. It's been a marathon in a way.
It has, yeah, and with everything we do, we think about it very carefully. Chris always takes the mickey out of me for saying this bit, but I always say I want it to be an event, and we have tried to do that over the years to try and make sure that you don't just fall into some kind of routine way of doing things, that every time you do something you think about it and learn from what you've done before and try to do something in a new way.
There's a great quote I saw from you where you said that being a Pet Shop Boy is a struggle between total embarrassment and total shamelessness. So this is a shameless bit, is it?
It is. Well, it's still the same thing.
It's still embarrassment too.
Well, you know, when we started, I had very little performing experience. I mean, when I was a kid, I was actually in a youth theatre, but and over the years, we've got much more confident than we used to be. To the point where I think we're sort of better at the whole thing than we were 15 or 20 years ago.
But one of the things that also strikes me, reading some of the stuff that you've said and even just talking to you for a few minutes, you have got a sense of irony, and having a sense of irony sometimes might not be helpful in a performance.
We have a sense of irony and also a sense of humour about what we do. But also there's an incredibly romantic sense about a lot of the Pet Shop Boys music, which I think is a bit underrated. And but the irony comes in useful, for instance, if you're dealing with politics in a pop song. I've always thought there are very few directly political pop songs. In fact, I can't really think of one. Whereas if you deal with it with a certain sense of humour, like on our recent album, we have a song called "I'm Was Stupid," which is inspired by that T-shirt you sort of see everywhere, and it's sort of about Blair and Bush, really. And so you can deal with something like that, but also it's sort of funny as well. So you're not banging people over the head with
Yeah,
it.
you're not. Then you don't
You're
preach.
not preaching.
Not preaching.
Preaching is what I think is quite difficult in pop music.
But Bob Dylan once said that at heart he was a performer, and he wrote the songs because he needed something to perform. I mean, is that you, or is the writing a completely separate activity in some way in your head?
Yeah, I mean, we started off as songwriters, and that is the main motivation behind the Pet Shop Boys, and it's also the reason why the Pet Shop Boys are still here, because I think over the years we've kept up the quality of our songwriting. Bob Dylan, I think, is very underrated as a performer. People think of him as a sort of political, almost a folk singer, and in fact, he's in his recent album particularly, he's like a vaudeville act. You know, he changes his image, has the top hat and the little moustache and all the rest of it. But I think it's true though that once you've written the songs, you start to think about which ones could be visualised live. Because in our stage show, we do try to visualise every song.
But then why is it? I mean, if songwriting was at the heart of it, would you care if you didn't perform again, you didn't do the stage show, and other people just did your songs? You would care.
Yeah, one time I wouldn't have cared, but over the years you get to like the relationship you have with an audience live. It's the time, otherwise you work in a vacuum. When you don't play live, you never get to see your audience.
And you get instant gratification.
Well, I don't know.
Or
There's
the
just,
opposite if they didn't like it.
it's quite interesting to see what they like and what they don't like, and also how it changes around the world. Our audience physically changes in terms of age range, sexuality, response around the world. It's quite interesting.
Well, tell me a bit more about that. I mean, who are they? Because presumably there's some people who saw you 20-something years ago, and presumably they're kids as well, perhaps.
I think we have a sort of a coalition of, we have 80s music fans, we have people who like electronic music, we have a very strong gay audience, we have regular pop fans, and also we have alternative music fans. So I mean, it's quite as our audiences are quite a wide variety of people.
One thing I wanted to ask is, you know, quite a few bands have taken a break and then come back, Take That, Duran Duran, Culture Club and so on. Even the Eagles, who said they would never tour again till Hell Freezes Over, and then the Police and so on.
Yeah.
I mean, you never completely stopped ever, did you? I mean, why didn't you? Why didn't you just sort of break up? It might seem an odd question. But why
no,
keep going?
we've never stopped at all. There hasn't really been a need to stop. I mean, as Ian McEwan had a phase where he stopped writing books. It's what we do, and we love doing it, and we always have some new ideas. And so we've had periods of a few months maybe where we've taken things quietly.
But do you think it helped that you became famous when you were much more mature, you were about 30, than the average kind of pop star? It tends to be in their late teens or early 20s.
I guess it helped in a way that I was a totally formed person. I mean, some people become, like Robbie Williams, you mentioned in the introduction, became famous when I think he was 16 or 17, so he's never done anything else. I mean, when you've had a proper job before, I think you value what you do more strongly than someone who hasn't been through that experience.
How does it feel, though, to... Robbie Williams says you're an influence, Madonna, Scissor Sisters, The Killers. I mean, that must make you quite proud, really. I mean,
yes,
culturally proud.
it's also the generation that we're in and that they're in. I mean, if you look at The Killers, Brandon Flowers, you know, used to hear our music and see our concerts in the early 90s in Las Vegas when he was growing up there. And it's sort of come out in his music a little bit now. In the same way that people of my generation are influenced by David Bowie and the Beatles and Tamla Motown and Marvin Gaye and all the rest of it.
But you are a very English band. Is that fair? I mean,
yeah,
worldwide audience, but you're very English. You don't ape an American accent when you sing, which is...
No, I deliberately, when we did West End Girls, which people tend to forget is a rap record, and was the first rap #1 in America. I remember Paul Weller saying to me at the time, when it was #1 in America, that he was surprised because it was so English. And I think Paul Weller had probably been told by his record company or whatever that they would never be very popular in America because what he wrote about and everything was so English. But since then, you know, Oasis are a pretty English-sounding thing in a way.
What is that? I mean, we both understand what it means to be an English band in some way, but can you put it into words? What are the bits of that?
I think it's about language. I think you get British artists who sing in American, just off the top of my head, like Mick Hucknall is culturally American. Elton John is culturally American. Paul McCartney is culturally British, and it's simply to do with the language you use and the accent you sing in, and actually speaking in an English accent. Because if you rap, I mean, if you think of West End Girls, sometimes you're better off dead. It's the instinct would really be to go, sometimes you're better off dead. It's a gun in your hand. And when I deliberately did it in English, it was quite difficult to do actually.
You could do a cover version in American,
yes,
perhaps.
But you know, you do that because it's distinctive, and also I am English, and I didn't want. I wanted. You know, one of the things we've always tried to be in our records is to sort of kind of be us a lot of the time.
I said also in the intro that you were the talkative one. I mean, in a way, you quite like this, don't you? You quite like engaging in debate, discussion, politics. Somebody once wrote about you. You'd be a great comment or leader writer for a newspaper.
They did.
Yeah, they did.
I'd hate
no
to
comment.
I'd hate to do that. In private life, and people who know us know that in fact the more provocative opinions come from Chris.
But he keeps them to himself.
But he keeps.
Well,
he
that's
doesn't just
boring.
keep them to himself. But he doesn't like. I mean, Chris has very, very provocative opinions about a lot of things, and but he doesn't feel very comfortable talking in public about them.
Well, you were described 10 years ago as, quote, an extremely intelligent, well-read, cultured 40-something with greying hair. It seems embarrassing to call him a Pet Shop Boy. That was by one of your fans.
Well, it's sort of true, but I think it's a weird thing. You know, years ago they used to ask Mick Jagger, "Do you think you'll still be doing this in your 50s?" And he would sort of say, "No, I can't imagine sitting in my wheelchair singing Satisfaction." Ultimately, he's not in a wheelchair, of course, but ultimately he is doing that. I think no one ever really expected that the audience for pop music, it's not really Neil Tennant that's the issue here, is that the audience has also grown, and there are people who come to our concerts who might even be in their 60s, and it's a perfectly natural thing.
It's interesting that you are very happy to use the word pop music, and I also said in the introduction that to some people that's almost pejorative, you know, that when they want to be culturally important, they say, we do rock music, but pop is somehow, it gets a bad press. Is that fair? It's throwaway.
We say pop because pop is short for popular, and that's what it's meant to be, and also it's a catch-all term, I think. When you say rock, it sort of implies something maybe a bit more important or whatever. You know, the New York Times reviews everything under the heading pop. So it's not just us.
You talked a minute ago about gay following, and of course some of your most moving lyrics are about gay experience. It's a sin being boring, your funny uncle, and so on. At the start, in the 80s, was that a very difficult time for you to be public about that, to come out? Was it because of the politics of it, or was it a kind of professional decision that you didn't want to alienate heterosexual fans?
No, I enjoyed playing with it. I enjoyed the provocativeness of it. I was aware that we had a very pop audience, and I knew from my Smash Hits experience that audience likes to speculate. They like to imagine, they like to even create their own version of a pop star, and therefore you don't give them too much, and they can invent you themselves. And I used to like that, and I used to like the fact that we'd write something with a provocative title like Rent, which obviously came from the phrase Rent Boy, and just because it sounded quite provocative. And I wanted to leave things to people's imagination.
And is that very different now? Because in a way, being gay in this society, at least, that's not true everywhere, but in this society is a matter of perhaps indifference to many people. It doesn't really matter one way or the other.
Yes, what the word gay, I think, is really outdated. It's very important that you say in this society, because Britain is very, very tolerant, generally speaking, not always about gays. The problem now is that people, to say gay assumes an entire range of cultural choices that people assume you're part of, and I find that a bit stifling. But I also think we should remember that, of course, in other countries, I was just reminded recently that in Moscow and in Vilnius, in the capital of Lithuania, they banned gay pride. In Iran, you know, last year they hung those two young, year before last, they hung those two young boys for homosexual acts. So at the same time, one can get too sophisticated. I think I have a tendency to get too sophisticated about this.
It's interesting you mention Russia, because you've got Pet Shop Boys have got a big following in Russia, and yet it is in Europe, Greater Europe, it is one of the most homophobic societies. Does that strike you as rather odd?
It's officially homophobic, although actually even Putin recently made a statement that sort of more or less indicated that he thought homosexuality should be tolerated, that all people should be valued, I think is how he put it. But yeah, I've never come across any homophobia in Russia, to be honest. And you know, Moscow's full of gay clubs and all the rest.
From
of
individuals,
it.
but
Yes.
from officialdom, obviously, yes.
I think
Gay pride
actually,
ban, as you said.
I think this homophobia through like the mayor of Moscow, you know, spanning gay pride, is because there are always people who feel that you can be too free. You know, at one time people used to say about gays in this country, oh, I'd have nothing against them as long as they don't flaunt it. And that, of course, is a kind of oppression, expecting people to sort of just keep quiet and get on with it and don't frighten the horses, you know.
But what do you have some responsibility as an artist to tackle that, as Elton John clearly thinks he does? And there were plans, weren't there, for a tour of gay artists around the world to address this issue, which came to nothing.
I don't know about that. There was a plan. Ourselves, Elton and the Sisters, have sort of very vaguely discussed performing in Moscow instead of having gay pride there, which would in effect become a gay pride. I don't know whether that's going to happen or not.
But you feel some responsibility at least to engage on that, because you talked about the ambiguity before.
I'm quite reluctant to assume any responsibility as an artist, because I think if you respect the audience, I think they have their own decisions to make and their lives to lead, and also their own influence on events through democratic politics. I think, having said that, the one thing where pop stars can make a difference on is on broad social issues, of which being gay is, I guess, is a pretty important one.
Derek Jarman, that you mentioned earlier, the filmmaker, of course, took a much more aggressive view right back in the 80s, didn't he, about
Yes.
this? Where you maintained your ambiguity about it,
Yes.
he really beat people up about it.
Well, I knew
Intellectually.
Derek really well, you know, and he used to have a lot of problems with Stonewall, which at that point was fronted by Ian McKellen, and Ian McKellen got a knighthood from the John Major government at that point, and he had a lot of problems with that. And I was used to say to him, and he eventually agreed that I said, you've got your people on the streets protesting, and he's got his people in Downing Street trying to get the law changed, and really you're working together. And I think there are those two completely different approaches. And in fact, between those approaches, you know, every year we used to have this show, the Equality Show, the Albert Hall, to get equality, the age of consent. We have that now.
You once said, or you were quoted as saying, that 50 years ago, quote, I'd have been married with 3 children, having affairs with men on the side, and frankly, I'd probably be happier. Is that true, do you think?
I think it's possibly true, yeah.
And happier?
I think I was making a comment there about how the whole gay movement came about through oppression, and then it became a sort of cultural thing, and now we talk about the gay community and all the rest of it. I think there was a time when sexual behavior wasn't quite so codified. Maybe I'm a little romantic about this, but I think in a way there is something much more preferable to that than in, you know, is someone gay or straight or whatever, you know. I often think human beings aren't quite so straightforward as that, as the labels would imply.
I wondered about the question of children as well, whether that was a bit wistful. I mean, in other words, that it's perfectly possible for a gay man or gay couple to adopt now.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's yes.
completely possible for you.
I
not
had a lot of offers from women, actually. But for various reasons, I decided that I wouldn't go down that route. No, I don't feel really wistful about it, but that remark I made there, I can't remember the context of it, but I was just probably comparing how one would have lived in the past with the way one lives now, and that it wouldn't just have been worse.
Well, if we get any offers, obviously we'll pass them on
Yes,
to you
okay.
right around the world. I won't ask you whether you'd be still touring in 10 years' time, because you kind of will give the Mick Jagger answer, I suspect.
No, I suspect we will be.
You probably. What I am interested in, though, is that you've reflected in the past that pretty much every decade since the 50s, some big technical or technological development has given pop music a kick, either the electric guitar or the synthesizer in your case and so on. I just wondered what's hot now, or what you would be looking for now.
Maybe the last big thing was when the sampler was invented, so people could sample chunks of music. I think that what's hot now is not really about the making of music, it's about the distribution of music, which I'm sure you've discussed on this program before. The digital revolution that's led to the complete, or leading to a complete change in how music is distributed, and is making the music business lose its power and get paranoid and weak. It's a very strange time in the music business. This one time everyone used to know how it all worked. I think at the same time it's quite exciting, because I think the whole way music is distributed and bought and sold is changing at the moment, and it'll be very interesting in 10 years' time to see if it's settled down.
But the reason why some people are in a sense of panic about it is not just that they will lose their money and power, but they have absolutely no idea where it's going to go, because downloading iPod generation just think completely differently from the way the kids in the 1980s did.
It is, and that people don't
necessarily
think so much in terms of albums. But actually I was talking to two of my nieces who are teenagers at the weekend, and they were sneery about iTunes. And they're like 14 and 17. And they said, no, we much prefer CDs. And they thought CDs, which they didn't used to think, were much cooler, because they said, we like to listen to the whole album. And I suddenly thought, God, you assume that something's happened and that's that. Maybe that's not necessarily the case.
Some of us still think vinyl is pretty cool, but that's perhaps showing grey hair.
Vinyl is perennially cool. It's always cool.
Okay, well, I'm glad I remain cutting edge on that. But does some of that explain, and the lack of perhaps the 21st century technological development in music, does that explain why so many bands are retro, so many stuff harks back to the 70s and 80s?
It's like everything, it's about technology. You can get, a major technological change that happened in this decade is that computer technology means on your laptop you can now have an incredible collection of vintage keyboards and sounds, and also drum sounds. You can have the same reverb digitally created as from like a Tamla sound in the mid-60s, and you can put it against a 1980s classic Korg synth sound and all the rest of it. And it's just all on your computer that you can carry in a briefcase wherever you go. And that's a really great thing in a way, but it does also encourage people to be retro.
Retro,
yes.
But also perhaps obsessed with the technology rather than, because to go back to what you were saying earlier in our conversation, one of the reasons you're very English is the words, the use of language,
yes.
the poetry,
yes.
which is English poetry
yes.
set to music.
Having said all of that, we are living in an age where it's very fashionable for kids. I can remember a time where we thought we'd won and that the guitar was kind of dying out. And now, there are a lot of kids who think it's very cool to have a guitarist, a lead singer, a bassist and a drummer. Very like the Arctic Monkeys, for instance. Or like the Killers, and they put a keyboard in that mix as well. So I think that, again, that sort of combination, that what you might think of as an old-fashioned combination of instruments, will turn out to be as perennial as a string quartet is.
On that note, Neil Tennant, thanks very much.
Thanks very much.
Pleasure.